Welcome to the Nanovation Podcast. Information about this and other episodes can be found at fillerlab.com/nanovation. If you like what you hear, be sure to tell a friend or leave a review at Apple Podcasts. It really does help. I welcome your thoughts and suggestions. You can contact me on Twitter at Michael Filler or via email at nanovationpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you to the Chi Foundation for their generous financial support.
It was, I would say, sort of a convergence of the technique and the desire to grow films that were just a few nanometers that brought ALD to the forefront.
That's Stacey Bent from Stanford University talking about atomic layer deposition, also referred to as ALD. It's a technique used to modify the composition and properties of surfaces. Since nanostructures exhibit a large fraction of surface atoms, ALD has become a quintessential tool for nanotechnologists. In this micro-episode of Nanovation, Stacey and I talk about where ALD got its start, how it works, how the semiconductor industry accelerated its development, and what opportunities lie ahead. I should also note that Stacey was my Ph.D. advisor. For those unfamiliar with the details of graduate school, you can think of a Ph.D. student as an apprentice, and a Ph.D. advisor as the master artisan. To be clear, nobody is perfect, especially not Ph.D. advisors, but they are responsible for training their Ph.D. students to conduct scientific research. And don't let the name advisor fool you. The training, which lasts from 4 to 6 years in the United States for STEM disciplines, is extremely rigorous. I am forever indebted to Stacey for training me. She demands and gets the best from her students in all of the areas required for performing top-notch science or engineering. Those areas include, but are not limited to, technical rigor, attention to detail, and clear communication. For teaching me all of these things, and also for not wringing my neck when I inflicted substantial damage to one of the lab spectrometers, I say thank you. And one last thing. I wanted to take a minute to mention that Nanovation is now a member of NSF's Science 360 network. You can check out all their great video and audio content, including this podcast, at science360.gov. We're very happy to be on board. And now, on with the show. This is the Nanovation Podcast, an exploration of big innovations emerging from small things. I'm Mike Filler, your host and a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Enjoy the show. So today, it's really fantastic to have Stacey Bent here from Stanford University, so thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
She is a professor of chemical engineering and has a whole series of other titles. Can I shorten this? Can I say the Singh Professor in the School of Engineering?
Sure.
Okay. And recently, about a year ago, named the Senior Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs in the School of Engineering. She's an expert in surface and interface science, and that means the analysis of surfaces and interfaces. In terms of the kinds of systems she focuses on, and there's many, but the focus is on photonic and electronic kind of energy applications. At least that's how I would characterize it. I wanted to have you here today to talk about something specific and something you work on, and that's atomic layer deposition, or ALD. I view this as an enabling piece of nanotechnology and nanomanufacturing. It didn't start that way, in some sense, but I think it's evolving that way, and I think it'll be very useful going forward. And so having an expert who's been working on ALD for quite a while was just a great opportunity. And so I was hoping you could start by talking a bit about deposition, kind of why we do it, and what the world looked like from a deposition perspective before this technique ALD came along. And then we'll talk about ALD, but I kind of want to paint a picture for what existed before it and what the challenges were to doing what people wanted to do.
Sure. Happy to talk about that. There have been for a long time great methods for depositing materials on top of other materials. Usually people think about thin films, so you want to modify the properties of some bulk material right at its surface, and so you want to put something down on top of it. Generally, those are classified into chemical versus physical methods. There are ways to do it in solution phase. My group has primarily focused on vapor phase methods. So in that category, there's both the physical vapor deposition. There have been, for a long time, preceding the popularity of ALD, ways of doing sputter deposition, for example, evaporation. And even in the chemical side of things, chemical vapor deposition has been really an important technology.
And so that's where we started. And what were the challenges? Like if you take CVD, chemical vapor deposition, what was hard about it and what didn't work for some applications?
I can only maybe answer that from the context of why would you leave CVD to do this atomic layer deposition we're talking about.
Right.
So CVD has a lot of great capabilities. It can deposit a wide range of different materials. Sometimes the temperatures that you have to use to deposit the materials are kind of on the high end, but not always. Some of the things that are harder to achieve with chemical vapor deposition are really fine control over the thickness, not always, but sometimes. And probably more importantly is the ability to coat a very highly structured surface uniformly with the same thickness everywhere. So that's called conformality. So how much can we have a film that's the same thickness at the top of a feature and all the way at the bottom of a feature if you have something like a trench or a pillar. And this is where atomic layer deposition really shines because it has advantages over CVD in that sense. But ALD is really just a variation of CVD. It's very much the same. People have effectively extended CVD, and a lot of the same precursors that are used for CVD are also used for ALD. So it's really in a class of chemical vapor deposition.
Okay, so then talk about how people get this conformality. What is it about the chemistry of ALD and the way ALD works that allows that conformality?
Right. So ALD relies on steps that are each self-limiting. So you put in a precursor and it reacts only with the surface. It won't react with itself. And you do it under conditions at which it will stop at no more than one layer at the surface. And then typically you would come in with a second precursor, sometimes called a counter-reactant, and it will do the same thing. It doesn't react among itself, but it'll now react with whatever you left there on the surface in the first step, and it will saturate at one layer at the most. And because you do it this way, you can just give the exposure long enough time to coat everywhere before you go into the next step. And because of that, you effectively are removing mass transport limitations or considerations, and that's how you can get really good coating everywhere in a high aspect ratio feature, something that has, high points and low points.
Do you know much about the history in terms of how we jumped from CVD to ALD and how that happened?
It actually has a pretty long history. It was developed in the 60s.
I didn't realize it was that long.
Yes, a long time ago. I think it even showed up first in a Ph.D. thesis in Russia in the 50s as I think it was called molecular layering. And so it was sort of developed in parallel in two places. One is the Russian groups were looking at it in molecular layering in the 60s, and then in Finland under Santola, who's often thought of as one of the founding fathers of ALD, had been looking at it for, I think it was called atomic layer epitaxy at the time, because it was epitaxial growth of materials, layer by layer, and they were looking at it for thin film electroluminescent displays. So it had a very specific application early on, very much a kind of a niche deposition technique, and really was more widely developed, I guess, starting in the 80s. And it wasn't really until more recently, probably in the 90s, late 90s, that it became more and more popular as I think the attention to application shifted to the semiconductor industry. And one reason for that evolution is that in the early days, so one thing about atomic layer deposition is it's quite a bit slower than some other deposition techniques because you're growing effectively one atomic layer on the order of 1 angstrom per cycle. So if you wanted to grow something that was microns thick, millimeters thick, it would take a very, very long time. So it was, I would say, sort of a convergence of the technique and the desire to grow films that were just a few nanometers that brought ALD to the forefront, because that's a great technique when you don't want to grow that much material. And in the evolution of microelectronics, device manufacturing, as things got smaller and smaller following Moore's law, scaling down to really small device dimensions and also very thin films, it became important to develop methods that could deposit things that were just a few nanometers thick with great control and great conformality. And so that's where you really see ALD having taken off.
So it started there, and that's where I was introduced to it, and that's around the time where you started working on it. And it was in the semiconductor industry. It still is.
Mm-hmm.
That's where it, as you say, took off. And then I guess we'll get to this in a second, but it's now jumping outside of the semiconductor industry. And it's interesting. It's kind of taken a while for people to get over the fact that it's not just the semiconductor processing kind of technique, that it's more general than that. So let's talk a bit about the work you've done on ALD and how it started, and maybe a little bit about what you're working on now and where you're going next, without giving too much away, of course.
So we got started in ALD maybe around 15 years ago because of getting back to what you said at the very beginning. Our interest in my research group is in surface chemistry and really understanding how to modify surfaces. And it was posed as a problem that maybe we could use surface chemistry to control where ALD took place. So we weren't working in ALD at all, but we thought we do know how to modify surfaces. And because it's very much a chemical process, it should be sensitive to what species are actually there on the surface. So, for example, if you have one material that has something terminating it, maybe ALD doesn't occur there, but on a different material it would occur. And you can imagine then taking advantage of that to do deposition in what we call area selective fashion, where it only deposits on one material or one region of a substrate versus another. And if you think about the kind of fabrication that's needed in making computer chips and integrated circuits, there's many levels of depositing material, removing it, patterning it, etching back, many, many steps. And if you could eliminate some of those lithography steps where you have to pattern and etch and instead just directly deposit where you want to, there's a lot of value in that. So that's how we got started.
Right.
And it was actually for electronics applications. We were trying to deposit gate stack selectively. So a high K gate dielectric by atomic layer deposition and a metal on top of that, only on silicon and not on the adjacent dielectric. That's sort of a transistor structure. And at the time, we actually were not even doing ALD ourselves. We were working with a colleague of mine, Paul McIntyre, who had probably started ALD a few years before I did. And that's really how we got into it. It was very much from the surface chemistry perspective.
Right.
So anyhow, after that initial start looking at selective ALD, we ended up building an ALD reactor in our lab and then developing programs to look at expanding it into other areas. So we now, fast forwarding 15 years, have projects looking at both very fundamental aspects of atomic layer deposition. For example, what are the chemical mechanisms that really lead to growth, and also how does it nucleate? How does it grow? To applications. So, for example, we apply ALD now to things like catalysis, photovoltaics, other electronic materials. And interestingly, we've now come full circle ourselves. And even though we weren't working on selective ALD for some of those intervening years, we've since picked that back up again because it's become a very important need of the electronics processing that they would like to be able to do efficient and very effective selective ALD. So we're looking at that once again. And again, very much relying on surface chemistry to achieve that.
Okay. Can you talk a bit about the materials, the spectrum of materials that you've worked on and that ALD has broadened into? For a second, I'll just say that the semiconductor industry started wanting to replace silicon dioxide, something at a higher dielectric constant, and alumina was used in hafnia and these other things, and those are now branching out, and there's more exotic materials people are depositing. Can you just talk about those types of materials?
There are literally hundreds of materials that can be deposited by ALD now. It spans everything from metal oxides, which you mentioned, lots of power in depositing a whole range of metal oxides, elemental metals, metal sulfides, metal nitrides, and materials with properties everything from insulators through semiconductors to conductors.
I've even seen, I feel like we started with binary, simpler materials, and then now ternary, quaternary, really exotic. I'll call them exotic things.
Right. Yeah, ALD lends itself really well to compositional control too, because you might imagine you have a process for depositing one metal oxide and you have another process for depositing a second metal oxide. And if you want to get a mixed metal oxide, you could just change out how you do your cycle. So the precursor for metal 1 plus the counterreactant, precursor for metal 2 plus the counterreactant. And what I think is really powerful about it is you can have compositional control in the vertical scale as well, just by how you change the pulses. So you could do doping, for example, of one metal in another oxide just by not pulsing that precursor very often, and you can get blends, you can get nanolaminates. So there's a lot of interest in that. One of the things that we have been looking at fundamentally is when you start mixing those processes, they don't always behave the way that they do when it's just the single binary process. And the chemistry that leads to those deviations from what we call ideality are quite interesting, and nobody really understands them yet.
Can you give an example of one?
Often when you deposit one thing on top of another, the growth rate will change dramatically until you get back to having kind of a layer of that second material. And some of the reasons for that could be that sometimes some of the precursors the ligands will end up etching back some of the first material. Other cases, you might have, one of the things we've just discovered recently is ligands that don't completely leave, and then they block the next step, and that's very sensitive to what the metal is that you're depositing. So there are all these complexities that are there. We've looked at a system on zinc tin oxide, and there you definitely see deviations from the ideal zinc oxide growth and tin oxide growth when you start to mix them.
Is there a potential for some of those atoms to change the kinetics of ligand removal?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Right. And there's some theory that groups are doing now. For example, Simon Elliott's group is in Ireland is trying to calculate what some of those ligand-metal interactions are and how they may vary when you start to mix different metals there on the surface.
Right. So let's talk about where ALD is going. Right. So maybe for a second you can talk about things that are exciting from your perspective.
I think there are several new exciting directions. So you mentioned that, and sort of building on what I had said, there was a very big emphasis for at least a decade or more on ALD for microelectronics, for electronic materials. People are now really looking at how to expand it to other application areas, and a lot of that is in the energy area. One of it, which is in catalysis, which my group works on. But ironically, some of the very early ALD experiments in the development were for catalysts back in the sort of 60s, 70s. Okay. Now, again, with our very strong capabilities in synthesis and characterization, it's become more useful and important to go back to ALD to see if we can really tune catalysts that way. So I think one of the exciting areas is new applications of ALD. But there's
for a second.
Yep.
Is it heterogeneous catalysis?
It can be heterogeneous catalysis or electrocatalysis, but yes, solids.
Should I envision it as I have a support and I'm using ALD to deposit small catalytic particles of controlled composition inside?
There are many ways you can do it. That would be one way. One is you can modify the support by ALD. Okay. Another is that you can build core shell particles by ALD. Okay. You can do lots of different things. So people are looking at every aspect of that. 3D designs as well. So there's the application areas, which I think are really exciting. But even in just the development of ALD, there's several areas that I think are interesting. One is, I think, selective ALD is a great area, and it's developing fast. People are coming up with really interesting methods to do that. There's the molecular layer deposition analog of ALD, which is where you incorporate molecular groups that stay in the film, not just there as a ligand on the precursor and then come off, but you're intentionally building polymeric type structures by layer methods. And you can either do that purely organic, or you can mix organic and inorganic, right, and then you get all kinds of fantastic properties. Right. There's been another related development of ALD, which is atomic layer etching. So people are now taking some of the same ideas that you have these, surface saturating reactions, but now you do it in an etching mode instead of a deposition mode, so you can remove material one atomic layer at a time. And there's huge need for that also for electronic applications. And then the last area I would mention is one of the things about ALD is it tends to be a slow process because you're literally adding material one angstrom at a time, like I said before. But there's been some really good development in high throughput ALD, roll-to-roll processing, atmospheric processes, in processes that depend on alternating the pulses spatially rather than temporally. The standard ALD is you pulse one thing, you wait a while, you pulse another thing. Spatially, you have jets of these precursors, and therefore you can move a substrate right through them. And so the exciting thing about the new development in the instrumentation is that opens up doors for manufacturing things that you need to make cheaply, and you're not going to be able to do at the sort of slow rates of a standard ALD process.
Right. So I mentioned earlier, and I'll come back to this, and this is a bit related to some of the things my group's been thinking about lately with large-scale nanomanufacturing. And so ALD Nanosolutions, founded by Al Weimer and Steve George from University of Colorado, aims to, basically they're doing it. They're building very large reactors, fluidized bed reactors, rotary bed reactors, and even moving bed reactors now, which kind of gets back to your spatial ALD, to process tons of material. Right? It's such a different scale. I'm going to get Al to come on at some point and tell the story of ALD Nanosolutions. This is a fantastic story of how no one believed they could do this. No one believed they could do it cheaply enough. It was a semiconductor processing technology. No one believed that they could do it on tiny particles because they'd all stick to each other. It's a great story, so I'll get him on. But I think it's a great example of the potential of ALD and kind of where ALD is going kind of from an applications perspective. So Stacey doesn't have a ton of time today because she's here visiting chemical engineering at Georgia Tech, so she has to go and meet with other people. But there's one question I usually like to ask at the end of the podcast, and that is, what do you like most about the craft of science and engineering? What is it that gets you up every morning to do science?
I really just like the excitement of discovering new things and solving problems. I think a lot of what we do is, trying to answer questions that people don't yet know how to answer and coming up with clever ways of solving them. Sometimes it's as simple as you just have a problem in the laboratory, right? You can't get something to work.
Printer's broken.
Well, hopefully not quite that simple, but sometimes it is. Yeah. And really just trying to be creative about how you can come up with solutions to problems and, learning things that people don't know and adding to human knowledge. Find that fascinating.
Well, Stacey, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike.
You've been listening to Nanovation. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a rating or write a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes are available at fillerlab.com/nanovation. Nanovation is recorded in the Marcus Nanotechnology Building on the campus of Georgia Tech. Andrew Cannon edits the show. I'm Mike Filler. See you next time.